Welcome to the Strong as Fuck podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Santucci, and join us for some strong conversations.
And we're back with another episode of the Strong as Fuck podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Santucci, and I got a very special friend here today. Just like always, I have a lot of special friends, but this gentleman is young, he's handsome, and I bet he's a better trainer than most people you know, and he's under the age, you're under 25,
I just
right?
turned 25.
You just turned 25. I met Ben Yannis, what, 4 years ago?
Yeah, 4 or 5.
And this kid comes into the gym and he's telling everybody else how to train the right way. And I go, who the fuck is this kid? And why does he think he knows so much shit? And come to find out, he does know his shit, and that's why he's here today. He built a following. I watched this guy grow from absolutely no social media to what, about 680,000 people right now?
Something like that, yeah.
So he's done a really nice job, and I want to dive into that. Take us through, you're a college kid, you went for exercise science.
Yeah.
And, you know, what was how'd you wind up at Hype? And, you know, because that's where we met. Hype Gym is a gym in Union Square. Probably one of my favorite gyms. If I didn't have my own gym, I'd probably still be at Hype with these guys. Take us through that. You get out of school, you come to Hype. How'd that all happen?
Yeah, so number one, intro didn't disappoint. I was expecting a phenomenal intro, so thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I was the classic, like, failed athlete story. I always wanted to be...
What did you play?
I played football and baseball for most of my life. So I was...
You weren't a good athlete?
Oh, well, I was good for, like, high school. You know,
Okay.
I was like, man, this kid's a good athlete, but, like, no scouting situation was occurring.
High school stud, college
High school,
stud.
like, quarterback, the whole thing. Quarterback.
In Jersey, right?
Threw some dimes. Yeah.
Okay.
Small
Here we
private
go.
school, though, so not like a St. Peter's type situation. More like a low level, you know.
Okay.
Like the equivalent of like D5 in college, if there was a D5 kind of a thing. But, you know, like most people who are in those positions, they get into training, they hurt themselves, they get into powerlifting maybe because they want to scratch some sort of athletic
And you were
itch.
doing a lot of that.
Yeah, and I was doing all that in college.
Yeah.
So when I stopped playing sports in high school, I sort of needed something to fill the gap. Lifting was the gap, or the lifting was what I filled the gap with. Powerlifting specifically. So when I met you 4 or 5 years ago, I was all about the powerlifting stuff. And, you know, a lot of the education, I think, came about from my poor experiences powerlifting, meaning just getting hurt, back hurting all the time. I know you have a lot of experience with that as well. Shoulders aching, muscles tweaking. So it was kind of like the typical story of I'm doing something wrong. What am I doing wrong and how do I change it? And then, you know, luckily there were a lot of people, I mean, luckily in some sense that, you know, a lot of people had a similar issue, right? So like people go into the gym, they lift, they're in pain, they don't know why.
Well, let's jump right into that, right? There's a lot of, I just somebody called me yesterday and I ran into a buddy of mine who was talking about, he's like, well, I was doing a lot of heavy lifting. I was doing some powerlifting. I was doing some CrossFit, and I was always banged up. From your professional opinion, because you do understand your shit, do you think it's the amount of volume people are doing, or do you think they're just doing it the wrong way?
Yeah, it's a really tough question because it's always so case by case. It's like one person might be doing something in a way where for whatever reason, it's like maybe their shoulders are comfortable here, but all they have to do is just change the shoulder position. Yeah. But a lot of people, to your point, I think end up doing just way too much, just on the whole, too much volume, too much total work for whatever motions they're having trouble with, or they're just trying to do too much too soon. So we were actually talking before the podcast about low back stuff, low back injuries. And I'd like to kind of simplify like the discomfort, the pain problem down to a general heuristic, which is like, if you have this bucket of stress, right? And, you know, stress being generalized, not just to the gym and to like the training stress, but also life stress, emotional stress,
Lack of
financial circumstances, sleep, whatever, nutrition. You put all that, and every day, like you fill the bucket, right? So it's like, some people may have a lot of space for the training stress based on their lifestyle, how good or not good their life is at the current moment. or just because of genetics. Some people just have huge buckets that they can fill up, right? A lot of IFBB professionals like are in a space where they can just do more and they get more. But some people, they just have these naturally smaller buckets, and they don't realize that doing the same thing that the person with the large bucket is doing is going to sort of allow theirs or force theirs to overflow. So I think at a very, very general level, we can look at like all the nuances of like, oh, how do I change this resistance direction? Or, you know, is it this specific exercise or is it this specific joint position? But ultimately it just comes down to, if you get hurt, if you are in pain, discomfort when you're lifting, you're simply just overflowing the bucket in some capacity.
Yeah.
And how you either change the size of the bucket or choose to fill it differently, I think is what allows for some amount of like sustainability longer term.
In 2020, when we met, I was actually in crazy amounts of pain. You remember?
Yeah.
You were helping me through it. We were doing a bunch of exercises. I'd feel better, and then it would get worse. I tell people this all the time. I went to go see a couple doctors. I got a CAT scan. They noticed there was a cyst on my brain. I started taking TRT, felt 100% better.
Yeah.
Now, what I hear from a lot of people is, well, I have herniated disc in my back. I need to get surgery. I tell people, just from my personal experience and clients that I've dealt with, it tends not to be a structural issue, but rather what you're talking about, this neurological response or muscular response to whatever we're dealing with. Do you agree with that? Or do you think there's always, because there's so many, every doctor I went to go see is, well, we're going to cut your back open and fuse your spine. I was like, whoa. That's not even the issue. Yeah. I don't think there's a structural issue wrong. What's your thought?
Yes. I mean, the interesting thing about this is that insofar as we currently understand the research to suggest, like, you can have tons of pain with zero structural issues.
Yep.
And you can have what present as very, very significant structural issues with no pain, right? So it's like, there's not necessarily a direct correlation between a structural issue and pain in the same way that there isn't a correlation necessarily between someone having no pain and like tons of structural issues. So there doesn't seem to be an alignment there in as clear a way as like, if I, you know, take a knife and I cut you on the arm, like it's a pretty clear cause and effect situation.
Yep.
But there are just so many influences when it comes to pain, not just like back pain, but any kind of pain, nerve irritation, joint discomfort, whatever people diagnose as like tendonitis, tendinopathy, all those sorts of things are similar in that sense.
So you've gone pretty viral over the past couple of years, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of people reaching out to you because you do have a very, I'm impressed by your stuff. I use a lot of some of the things that you've come up with, and listen, to anybody out there who's using his shit, give him the credit he deserves because he's developing a lot of really cool stuff.
Thanks, man.
And, you know, I always tell people, I'm like, yeah, this fucking kid I know, he's a genius. He's really good at, you know, kind of breaking this down and helping people really understand biomechanics at a simple level. Because a lot of times the stuff that you've taught me, I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand that a lot better. And sometimes reading them from a textbook or trying to get, you know, a more thorough understanding of it tends to be pretty dry and overworded. And I think you do a really good job of like doing great videos on that. I'm sure you've had people reach out to you, be like, hey, I'm dealing with some back pain. What should I do? You know, what's your first recommendation to people out there who are like suffering with some sort of back pain? Because when I was going through the research, it was like 70% of adults over the age of 30 will have some sort of back discomfort. Right? Throughout their life.
I think back pain is definitely the most prominent example, but I also generalize this to like any kind of pain symptom. And it's interesting. I mean, you talked earlier about just my progression in terms of like the formal education stuff, because I studied a lot of this stuff in college, you know, orthopedic anatomy, neuromuscular physiology, but it really wasn't until I got away from the textbook stuff that I felt like I could start to help people. But that's also not to just dismiss the value of like the formal education stuff, because it's kind of like, to give a simple recommendation, you need to have gone like deep in some direction and then
lay some sort of foundation.
Yeah, it's like, because otherwise you're kind of just speaking out of your ass, right? Or maybe you're just someone who has 40 years of experience and you might not be able to describe or articulate why someone is experiencing what they're experiencing, but you have seen this thing, you know, you have tons of clients, you see a particular pattern of like, oh, this person might need to make this tweak. You don't necessarily need to know why, but you can make that change. So to your point, I probably get probably between 2 and 4 messages a day, if I had to just guess, that falls along the lines of those kinds of questions. And years ago, I used to give very specific recommendations. And I think that the more that I have come to understand, the more generalized the recommendation, the less specific, because the only way you can be specific in reality is if
You're
the
with
person's in
that
front of you,
individual,
right?
yeah.
It's like, hey, let's make this change. Let's make this change. So I can like provide on a case-by-case basis things that have generally, in my experience, worked for people. But at this point, I'm very uncomfortable being like, you need to do this exercise, or you need to change this, or you need to avoid this. So on a very, very general level, what I would say to the back pain question, and again, it applies to all those kinds of pains or symptoms, is number one, you probably want to figure out what seems to be the most correlated to your pain. Okay, so just
A movement pattern or
yeah. So for example, like if you are someone who goes into the gym and you love to deadlift, but every time you deadlift you get pain,
yeah.
it's not to say that you should avoid deadlifts forever, but like, hey, just for now, let's maybe like change the implement. So it could be like, hey, I'm doing barbell deadlifts. Let me see how a trap bar feels.
Yeah.
Right. And any personal trainer with any experience knows that that kind of a change can make all the difference. Like,
World of difference.
instantly,
Yeah,
someone
yeah.
could be out of pain. But another person, maybe they swap implements, still the same issue, right? Maybe it's a load tolerance issue. Maybe it's specifically in that moment you're doing too much. Whatever it happens to be, you're just overflowing the bucket, right? So to speak.
I
So
find sometimes that like changing the exercise, still training the hamstrings, because everybody's like, well, the only way I could do this is by training deadlifts. It's like, no, train your hamstrings by doing seated curls or laying curls. And do that for a couple months and see if the pain still exists when you go back. to it. Because I hate calling it a strength issue. Like, oh, I'm weak.
Yeah.
It's like, not necessarily. I think the movement patterns screwed up somewhere, and you have to kind of discover where that is.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to highlight, which is terms like strength or terms like
Weakness.
tightness, weakness.
Yeah.
They're all these like really vague terms that people use to confidently diagnose like something. You know, it's kind of like there's no real basis for the term. And just to maybe give a concrete example, like let's say you're doing a leg curl, okay? And someone is using 100 pounds on the leg curl. I could compare that to the amount of weight that you or I use on the leg curl and say, oh, that's really weak, or oh, maybe it's really strong relative to us. But in any case, it's a generalized relative term. So it's kind of like we're just saying nothing. We're just saying words. So, you know, on a case-by-case basis, even if you make a claim like this person's hamstrings are weak, then I have the question of like, well, how are you measuring that, right? Because one of the only ways that you might be able to measure that is by doing a leg curl. But then you might ask, well, how many muscles contribute to bending the knee? And depending on what you consider a muscle, how you divide it up, there could be 9 muscles that contribute to a leg curl. It's like you have your hamstrings, you have the muscles on the front side of your hip that run behind your knee, you have the calves, right? So if you're doing a leg curl, how are you isolating for a single muscle or a single division of a muscle? You know, you're not. So I think that if you follow any of these like generalized claims sort of a little bit deeper, what you find is that I think that they're claims that are born of a need to just like say something and like put something out on social media. And they're also these claims I think that are associated with some degree of like confidence, which isn't really confidence. It's kind of just like some kind of insecurity with saying like, hey, I don't know, but like, let's just see what happens if we explore a bunch of different things.
So, and that gets me to my next point. A lot of doctors diagnose people with, oh, you have a labrum tear, or you have some MCL issue, or you have herniated discs in your back. Like I tell people, and I'm not always right. I'm not a doctor, so don't take this as gospel. But from what I've discovered on a daily basis, I work with somewhere between 8 and 12 people a day at least.
Yeah.
And a lot of people come to me with these symptoms and problems and diagnoses from doctors that I just feel like I think this old way of diagnosing people in a hospital or some sort of clinic is like, I don't really know what the fuck's going on in your body, so we'll just call it this. And, you know, you kind of run with that. Like, what's your thought? Because you understand biomechanics and exercise physiology a lot more than I do. And I just know from experience, I've never really studied it to the degree that you have. But a lot of these diagnoses, I tend to think like, oh, I have this issue. How do I need to go and get surgery? And I'm like, whoa. Before you go and let some butcher start cutting into your arm because he wants to buy a new fucking boat, let's try a couple things, right? Yeah. So I tell people that all the time. I go, let's try to figure this out before you go and get cut open. Like, what's your thoughts on the surgery aspect? And
Yeah. So
like, do you think there's all these people, especially when it's like younger kids, predominantly females, who come in and they're like, I have 2 labrum tears. I'm like, how? You've never played a sport. How'd you tear both your labrums?
Yeah.
You know?
So, I mean, to the labrum specific thing, like if you scan, I know that there's research on this. I'm not someone who can and confidently recite like authors and dates and whatnot, but most people, let's say beyond the age of 50, have some kind of history of like disc slipping.
Yeah.
Who also don't, many of which don't have pain. A lot of people have shoulder labrum, quote unquote, tears or issues, or just some kind of wear and tear. It just comes along with the territory of like being a person.
Mm-hmm.
So, I personally had tears in both of my labrums after playing football in high school. I did the whole like ink injection thing. I had, got into the MRI machine, and I have all that diagnosed, but like I could still lift in a ton of different ways without pain. So I think the most important thing for people like in the general public is to take what the doctor is saying seriously, but not so seriously that you aren't willing to pursue alternative routes and to look in other areas that are maybe less invasive and potentially less damaging in the long term. So I'm not like anti-doctor, I'm not like anti-medicine, far from it. But I do think that a lot of people have these bad experiences with doctors only because they don't necessarily have the information themselves to be able to troubleshoot these things.
Yeah, and I think, and that's where a good trainer or a good PT comes into play, where it's like, I believe that surgery should be the last resort, right? It should be the last thing on the menu. I had a client of mine years ago who, I can't do anything with my knees. I can't do anything with my knees. She had 4 surgeries on the same knee.
Yeah.
When do you get to the point where you're like, hey, maybe the surgery is not helping, right? Like, how many times are you going to let somebody cut your knee open before you're like, okay, maybe I should try some sort of alternate movement? Because I believe that humans are much more resilient than we think we are, right? We've been on this planet hundreds of thousands of years now, and we've been able to survive. If our ancestors were this fragile a people, we wouldn't be here, right? So I tell people, like, we've had to deal with a lot more. Like, modern medicine is what, 100 years now, 200 years at most, that like we understand the body as much as we do. I think there's a lot of times that we've had to deal with, stress and pain and all these things, and we kind of just figured out different ways. Like, I love acupuncture. I'm a huge acupuncturist. I know Pat used to give me shit all the time about acupuncture, but I go, it's been around for thousands of years, right? The Chinese have been doing it for a very long time. And if it was bullshit, I feel like it would have been debunked by now, right? I mean,
yeah. So I mean, you'll on the topic of acupuncture, you'll see a lot of like the evidence-based PT crowd kind of poo-pooing it just because it's like, a lot of the effects seem to be chalked up to this placebo effect. We can't like localize or isolate for. This is the mechanism, and this is the cause, and this is how it decreases pain. But much like massage therapy, which could sort of fall into a similar bucket, it's like if massage therapy or if acupuncture are these things that seem to remove stress from the bucket, it doesn't matter. It could be, you laying down and watching a football game on a Sunday, or it could be going to acupuncture or going on a walk or playing video games. I don't care what it is. It's like the things that remove stress or give you the perception that like stress is being removed in some way, like all those things are useful in some capacity. I think the issues then start when, in lifting and like current lifting culture, you see a lot of the times people thinking or viewing things like foam rolling or mobility work as these like panaceas, right, that can sort of fix all your issues. I think the problems start to arise when you're doing things in the gym that, let's say, are way beyond your stress capacity bucket, and then you're going in all these other directions to look for solutions, when in reality it's like, let's first start to identify maybe what in the gym are the biggest players that are contributing to your health or lack thereof. So I don't have a problem with any specific modality, but where I do have problems is when people start to imagine that these kinds of interventions, acupuncture, mobility, foam rolling, any of them, are these like magic pills, right? And we see the same thing in like nutrition and diet spaces, right? Where people are looking for what's the right diet? Is it keto? Is it paleo? Is it intermittent fasting? Like the list goes on. And so many people would be better off just, let's say, starting to measure their protein intake, right? So many things get elucidated or illuminated, just by doing something like that. So I think that the solutions to many of the common problems that we face are oftentimes like just right in front of us, screaming at us. But to your point, we are humans and we are like interested in these potentially more nuanced things. But we might just be looking in the wrong places. But like I said, I think if people are really taking care of the quote unquote, the big rocks, the sleep, the nutrition, the training, the daily energy expenditure, your daily steps, are you seeing friends on a regular basis? Are you isolating and are you scrolling on your phone all day? Like those to me are the heavy hitters. And then once we've like at least achieved some sort of common threshold on all those things, then it makes more sense to me to look toward like specialty. And then it makes more sense to me to actually try to figure things out in tandem with a professional. And I think that like I realize a lot of things now just by the kinds of questions that I get. And so it'll be like someone will say, what's the best exercise for like this muscle group? And my first question is always like, I mean, let's say years ago, just to draw parallels between these contexts, I used to be like, do this and this and this. And now I ask like, can you put a little bit more effort into your side of the question? And can you actually start to maybe experiment on your own? Like, oh, I don't have to use a barbell to do curls. Let me see how dumbbells feel. Oh, dumbbells don't feel great. Let me see how cables feel. Or let me see how this easy bar or this machine feels. So it's just kind of like a willingness to experiment on your own. And that can be scary for people if they don't have experience doing something. So it's like, it's kind of this tricky battle and this tricky balance between trying things out on your own and exploring like what is unknown to you or what is uncertain, but then also relying on the professionals in any given industry to give you information that is useful.
So there's so much controversy online behind the levels of stress, what a pump does. I mean, and these are kind of some of the questions I had for you. Like I've heard a lot of people say, everybody chases a pump. That was the thing. For the longest time, it's like the movie Pumping Iron was just basically like chasing a pump, trying to get bigger, blood flow through the muscle, whatever you want to call it. What's your thoughts on like, okay, I'm pumping iron, I'm lifting heavier weight. Yeah. Does that result in more muscle mass?
Yeah, so this is kind of like the correlation causation discussion, which is like for people who are listening who don't maybe know. I just want to give a very simple example and like unrelated to the hypertrophy thing, and then we'll get back to it. Like if you walked in here, if you and I walked into this podcast studio today and one of us, let's say, farted like heavily or something like that. There is a correlation between us walking into the studio and one of us farting, but that doesn't mean that walking into the studio was the cause of either one of us. Could have been breakfast, could have been stress, could have been some weird drink, like coffee that you are just chugging before the podcast, right? It could be any number of things. So in the same sense, like a little bit of a silly comparison, but hopefully that landed. But
I get what you're saying.
Right. If you're lifting weights and you're doing curls and you're getting a sick pump, and you finish the session, next day you're sore, maybe you recover the following day, 72 hours later, there is a clear correlation between consistently getting sick pumps in muscles and growing muscle. And I think that initially, like in the pumping iron days, let's say, like the pump is better than sex, to quote Arnold, or at least as good. People were really obsessed with it and hyper-focused on it. And I think this happens with every kind of topic in any industry, which is like when one topic or concept gets elevated to a very high level, there's an investigation of that topic, rightfully. It's like a very popular thing in the space. And what happens is when any research comes out to suggest that maybe this isn't what we thought that it was, all of a sudden the pendulum swings 180 degrees in the opposite direction, which is kind of just like it's just the human nature thing all over again, which is like, hey, this thing is popular and people are doing it. Let me do it, or let me look into it, or let me invest time into learning about it. And a lot of the times what happens in these particular cases, nutrition as well, is there's this really, really strong backlash. So now people are saying, don't chase the pump. It's not important. It doesn't cause muscle growth. We know it doesn't cause muscle growth. And the funniest thing is that any researcher, like Brad Schoenfeld is a great example, who takes these things seriously, who dedicates their life to this research, will say, hey, this is what we know. This is what we don't know. And here are these tentative conclusions that I can give to you. And the tentative conclusion about the pump right now is, well, we might not know exactly what's causing hypertrophy aside from this muscle tension thing, but we can't really say either way whether or not the pump is really, really synergistic with that, or it's really additive, or it takes away from it. We can't really strongly sort of make a claim. Yeah. So the people that are most knowledgeable on any topic are usually the least likely to make strong claims.
Yeah.
So insofar as it relates to the pump, I'm not confident that the pump causes growth. I'm also not confident that it has nothing to do with growth. So in my estimation, it's like, okay, if I'm growing this muscle and over the last 3 months, I look at the size of my rear delts, which I personally have been focused a lot on, and I see that there's visible growth there that I either subjectively measure or in some way maybe I do a scan just in a theoretical scenario. And it's like, this muscle is bigger. Do I personally give a shit about what caused that? No. But I know that what I did, whatever combination of things that I did, it seemed to in some way work. Yeah. You know? And I think that for the average person is infinitely more valuable than being like, oh, well, the pump, you know, is this thing mechanistically, and so therefore it doesn't cause this, or therefore it does cause this.
So on muscle tension alone, right? Yeah. Because I have a NASM. I've been training for a long time. There was always this understanding that time under tension helps build muscle, right? Yeah. Like any stress on the muscle, and this will lead into the next question as well, but any tension on the muscle is going to force the body into a position to where when you recover, you're going to grow from there. Mm-hmm. So what's your thoughts on like time under tension, or the best way to start to build hypertrophy? Because most people nowadays want to look a certain way, and you're not going to get that until you start to build some sort of hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. You could build strength, but strength doesn't necessarily lead to size.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So there's definitely, to the correlation causation thing, there's definitely correlation between, you know, how big someone is and how strong they are. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes our mode of comparison with strength is like, how much can you bench, mm-hmm. right? But like, does that mean that maxing out?
That's because you're from Jersey. That's
right. Yeah, I guess so. I just say 500 now to anyone who asks. But you know, it's kind of like if I get down on a chest press machine and I max out the stack on the chest press and I do it for 15 reps, like, is that all of a sudden now just like no longer strength? Like, obviously it is. But in terms of like the time under tension thing, this is kind of, to me, a similar conversation of the pump situation where, by the way, like mechanical tension, muscle tension, all it refers to for the listener is like tension is just a pulling force. So if you have a rubber band and you grab two ends and you pull it apart, that is a tension-based force, and that's what your muscles do. That's how you move stuff. That's how you prevent yourself from being moved. Like that's what contraction is. So it's not, it seems to be now that we understand that it's not necessarily like the time under which you're lifting. So if you, Kenny, can curl, I don't know, let's be charitable. Let's say you can curl 40-pound dumbbells for 10 reps. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to think.
I'll just give you that.
I can't.
I'll just give you that. And let's say the length of that set for 10 reps was, I don't know, 25 seconds, 30 seconds. Does that mean that if you cut the weight in half and triple the time of the set, you just move really, really slowly, like inch by inch by inch, you're really concentrated? Does that mean that because you did it for more time that you'll see more growth? Well, in terms of like what we currently understand, that doesn't seem to be the case. But what does seem to be the case is that in either one of those scenarios, if you approximate some kind of high effort in the set, if you get to a point where each rep toward the end of the set is slowing down, maybe you get to a point where you can't do another, you just stop, you try to do a curl, but you can't. Whether it's with 40 reps or whether it's with 5, we seem to see growth in both cases, and growth that isn't necessarily significantly different. So to me, like what the recommendation comes down to is find exercises that feel good on your joints, find exercises that give you an immediate pump response. I know it's kind of fringe to say now, but like God forbid you get a pump. Yeah. Find exercises that you feel like you can do consistently without the discomfort thing coming up. And use any rep range in the 5 to 20-ish zone, and do those sets to some degree of difficulty where when you get to the end of the set, you're struggling. You get to the end of the set, you can't do another, or you're at least slowing the repetition down in some way involuntarily. You're not consciously slowing it down.
So there needs to be, because this is what I tell everybody, there needs to be some level of external force and stress put on that muscle for you to see any really adaptation, correct?
Yeah. And it's always that conversation is always going to come down to where is the person right now? So for example, I mentioned to you that I started training my mom recently. Does my mom need to do biceps curls to absolute failure? And does she need to, once she gets to absolute failure in that set, do I need to self-assist her so that she can do a drop set? And then I'll lower the weight, she'll do another drop set, and then she'll start doing Maya reps, and then she'll do, no, like she probably needs to do a set anywhere within 10, 20 reps of failure. She could literally do a set of 5. And next week, and this has happened, she could do probably twice the amount of reps with the same weight. And of course, like as you mentioned earlier, that has a lot to do with the brain component of it as compared to like just the amount of tension that you're able to create. But the more advanced that you get, if you're an IFBB pro, are you going to grow and get away with doing sets that are 10 reps from failure? No. So it's always a question of like, where is the person currently at? Where are they coming from? And what do they need in this moment? And what they need in this moment is only something that you can determine in retrospect. So I can't make a guess as to whether you'll grow right now, but I can look back on weeks and months and years of training and be like, something in there seemed to work. I don't know what exactly it is, but like, this is what worked for me.
At the end of the day, I feel like really nobody has a finite answer, but you have a lot of these people who out there who are being like, hey, I'm using these, the muscle stimulator.
Yeah. Like,
well, they have those pads that basically show activation through the muscle too.
Yeah. Like the EMG, the surface.
The EMG machines. And people are like, well, the EMG machine says that this muscle worked 70% harder when you did it this way instead of this way. What's your thoughts on that? Because there are so many times that I have arguments about people who are so dogmatic about like, well, you should never do a chin up and you should never do cable flies. I had an argument, and I never engage in this, not like you do. I never engage with people online because I'm not an expert in the field. I know what I know. I've worked with plenty of clients, but I don't consider myself an expert because I'm not dogmatic about any philosophy, right? There was a guy who was talking, I had one of the girls in the gym was doing a upright row.
Yeah.
And the guy's like, you should never do upright. I go, hold on. You heard this from some dipshit online who said you shouldn't do any internal rotation, upright rowing. I go, but if I could perform an exercise with absolutely no pain, then why wouldn't I continue to do it? And I'm a big bro science guy. That's the way I grew up. That's what I saw. And I still love training.
Dom Mazzetti.
Yeah. I've worked with, I've had the opportunity to work with some really, jacked dudes who look incredible, who do upright rows. And I go, well, if this guy, and this guy have done it, does it necessarily mean they got jacked from that? Probably not. Does steroids come into play? Absolutely. I mean, that's the only thing we could all commonly say that they work.
They do work.
Yeah. So I just said, I think it's problematic when people start to say, don't do this and don't do that. You should never do this. You should never do that.
Yeah. And two threads there. One's the EMG and then the other is the second part. So I'll go back to the EMG thing. EMG, for those that don't know, measures muscle excitation. So there's a distinction between excitation and activation. I think they're different things to my understanding. And what we're really looking at when we're talking about muscle growth is the tension side of things, like we just discussed. So surface EMG, slapping an electrode, on the surface of your skin, that is a proxy for muscle tension, which basically means that in the same way that strength might be a proxy for hypertrophy progress, like if you're seeing weights increase week to week, it's likely that there's something good happening there. But EMG can show high or low scores in a relative sense for a whole host of reasons that people are not aware of. So one example would be like, all right, Kenny, let's compare the chest activation between a dumbbell press, okay, and you sitting here right now and you squeezing the hell out of your pec. So if I said, Kenny, like flex your pecs, you would see a very, very high EMG activation score if I slapped it on your chest, right? And you might even see a lower EMG activation score, at least on the first couple reps of a dumbbell press with a heavy load for you.
Mm-hmm.
So which one of those situations do you think most people would be like, this is probably the thing that we should do to grow my chest, right? No one would, in their right mind, I think, would say, I'm just going to sit here and squeeze, but that's what people ultimately are doing. So it's not that it can't be a useful proxy. It's just that in many cases, especially research settings, like I see all the time, I'll see studies where they'll say this muscle showed this activation and it was much greater in this variation and this variation. And I'll look at photos of the study, and this is not to knock any researcher individually in particular, because there are a lot of things about research that I don't understand, but I'll look at the anatomy and the sensor will literally be on a different portion of the muscle. Like let's say someone is measuring lats, like which of the 4 different divisions of your lats are you measuring? Because those are all very different things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you make a mistake in where you place the sensor, in the setting that you use it in what you tell someone to do during the exercise, all of a sudden you're not like just measuring the effectiveness of the exercise in a one-to-one clear-cut way. You're doing it amongst this amalgamation of like 10s, 20s different variables that all are contributing to that scenario. So EMG is useful in situations where people are very, very controlled, very specific about the biomechanics, and also situations, and you'll see this in research, where people don't make very strong claims about hypertrophy outcomes. Because if there's one thing that we currently understand about EMG, it's that there's not a clear one-to-one relationship between what is activated in an exercise and what grows. That's like what we currently understand. Andrew Vygotsky is someone who's done a lot of work on that. So shout out to Andrew. The second thing that I'll say about the exercise prescription thing is the upright row conversation is one that comes like very early on, specifically like in PT spaces, that they teach you like internal rotation of the shoulder in tandem with elevation is going to be like an ouchie situation. And that's something that I bought into for several years. And I was like, don't do that. That's not going to be good. And then one day I ran into someone who was doing like a normal dumbbell lateral raise, and they're like, oh, this feels like crap on my shoulder. And just for the hell of it, I was like, you know what? Like I've been told this thing my whole life. Let's just see how the upright row feels. And like, lo and behold, the upright row was the thing that felt good for that person, and the lateral raise wasn't. So I just feel like so many of these claims, these like internet claims, just come from people lacking the experience. And that's not meant as like some sort of emotional personal dig. It's just like, if you've never encountered a situation where this thing hasn't worked out the way that you're saying that it should, then you have no data to show you otherwise, right? So I think it's just a matter of experience, to be honest.
As someone who's spent the last 25 plus years of my life wrestling, jiu-jitsu, long distance running, triathlons, there are so many scenarios and situations that I've been in, right? Even doing strongman competitions, powerlifting.
Yeah, you did a lot of shit.
Yeah. Like I've done a lot of this stuff where textbook says never to do this. Don't round your back. Don't do. But the other day I was basically suplexing a guy off the ground, trying to pull him up off the ground, and I'm rounding my back. It's the same way I do Xerxer deadlifts. I'm like, when I do Xerxer deadlifts, they feel great. And my back is completely rounded. I'm trying to get my elbows to the floor. For an athlete that's prepared, now would I start somebody off that's relatively new to weight training? Absolutely not. But for me, because I do this and I'm in that position in a practical situation, well, I should be able to train that plane of motion. So that's why I try not to be dogmatic about certain things. Like the upright row, I have similar situations where it's like, they don't like doing shrugs, so I have them do an upright row. It feels better.
Yeah.
You know, they get some sort of stimulus out of it. Great. Awesome. That's why I try to stay away from a lot of that stuff. And there's so many people online. I mean, everybody's a fucking expert now. I feel like in the last 10 years, because of social media, everybody's an Instagram, doctor or trainer. One of the things I want to talk to you about, though, was, and this is because everybody's probably thinking, oh my God, these guys are such nerds. They just give a shit about muscle growth. And for the people out there who give a shit, I mean, this is obviously a great conversation. For those of you who don't understand, to relate it back to the more general public, I'll talk to predominantly females about this, and they say, well, I love doing Pilates. It feels great. It's lengthening my muscles. I developed this incredible physique from Pilates. I go, you kind of look the same as when I met you before you were doing Pilates, but you must see something I don't.
Yeah, you can't say that though.
No. So what are your thoughts on the lengthening of muscle tissue? Not to say I like Pilates. I've done it before. I use it as an accessory to what I'm doing, but I always tell people like, do it. If you're having a good time, I encourage people to do anything, dance, yoga, whatever it is, continue to do that. But what's your thoughts on, doing exercises like that or doing programs like Pilates and yoga to develop muscle?
Mm-hmm. So
can it be done?
So yes, it definitely can be done. But let me just refer back to something I said earlier, which is depends on where you're coming from. So can you do Pilates and grow muscle? You, Kenny? Probably not at this point, given the amount that you lift, the amount that you're active, the amount of muscle you've grown, the strength that you have. Is someone capable of growing muscle from Pilates who has never been physically active?
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah. Much in the same way that if you are, a post-op patient who's just shattered your pelvis and you're bedridden for a month, the stimulus to stand up out of the bed is probably too much for you to handle. And, simply doing knee extensions off of the edge of the bed is probably going to be enough to stimulate some kind of growth, right? So it's always just a conversation of where's the person coming from. I think in the lifting population, and even in the populations that would be listening to this that are more like Gen Pop types of people, Pilates is, well, let me just reframe this. You ever seen the movie Men in Black?
Of course.
Okay. Are you surprised I've seen that movie?
I'm surprised you've seen any movies. I mean, so many generations behind.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So you know how they have that little device and it they snap it in front of the person. It's this big flash and they just forget everything that happened in the last 24 hours or whatever it is. Or whatever you choose. If I could do that to everyone in the world in relationship to exercise concepts and yoga concepts and Pilates, I would do it. And what I would specifically remove is just the name of everything. So if we just remove the name and the emotional attachment to everything, what we would just be seeing is we would see a human body, and the human body has muscles and tendons and ligaments and all this other crap. And what we would see is those muscles, that anatomy, we would see that there's just this weird looking organism that is interacting with things that it's moving, right? It's just go down to the most basic level. So if you're talking about yoga, if you're talking about Pilates, if you're talking about Zumba, I don't care what you're talking about. You're just talking about a person who is dealing with force. And so all these things just fall along a spectrum of low force, high force, or more range of motion, less range of motion, right? So when you start to look at Pilates, it's am I doing this exercise where my leg comes all the way up to my face and I'm maybe extending my leg down and that feels good on my glutes? Yeah, but fundamentally, that in many ways is no different than doing a single leg lunge, right? Obviously, there are differences, but the point is just to say that rather than to look at these things as binary, this will be
grouped under this category.
Right. Yeah. It's more let's just look at all this shit along a continuum. And if you're someone who has been weight training for a decade and you've grown significant muscle mass, anything that is on the sort of less stimulative side of the spectrum is probably not going to continue to push you in that direction, right? But weightlifting especially, I think, is the most versatile because unlike, there are progressions and regressions in Pilates, no doubt, but you're still constrained to some degree by the nature of it being Pilates. You're on this reformer, right? You're doing all these motions on the reformer. And so in essence, there are only so many things that you can do on that reformer, at least to my understanding. I've never taken Pilates class, but
I have.
I'm not saying I wouldn't, but this is just my understanding.
Yeah.
So in the same way that or rather in a different way, weightlifting is just the least constrained form of a human in a human's anatomy interacting with force. You can just accomplish so many different things because you have so many different options.
Well, and I think that was so perfectly put, putting it on this continuum and understanding that hey, if your goal is to look significantly better, then I would probably skip the first half. You could do it because you like doing it and it's fun and you like the fucking music that the teacher plays, whatever it is. But if your goal, how do I get the most bang for my buck, right? So coming from a guy who's an expert in the field, and I respect what you've done, and anybody out there who doesn't follow him, I highly recommend it because I think the proof is in the pudding. You built an incredible following because you do know what you're talking about, and you are very smart when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Wouldn't you say to kind of skip a lot of that other stuff and just go right to the juice, right?
So I mean, if someone were asking me for my honest opinion, what is my personal bias?
Yeah.
Like absolutely, just because you can do so many things in the gym that you just can't do anywhere else. Like let's just go back to the example of the person who's bedridden for a month.
Yeah.
A lot of people will say, like, I'm sure you've heard this a million times over, like, you need to squat. You need to squat to grow legs, or you need to squat because it's functional, or whatever other buzz term, smoke bomb term you want to put out there. What happens if you encounter someone who literally can't stand up off of a chair? You know, it's like now all of a sudden we're having a completely different conversation that is still within the context of the whole discussion. So if you make a claim like you need to start with lifting, well, what if this person, you know, isn't capable?
Yeah.
So, but the advantage to lifting is if you can get that person into a gym setting, or even a setting where, you know, they're just in their home and they have a couple weights, there's so many things that you can do to meet that person where they're at that you might not be able to do in a yoga class or a Pilates class. I've had so many friends who go into a yoga class for the first time and like they're just unbelievably uncomfortable the entire time. And I just wonder, you know, is that an issue with yoga or the teacher? I'm not necessarily sure, but if someone comes to me and I'm training them, I'm going to find a way to make it. I mean, obviously it's going to be uncomfortable for them because it's new, but like you're much more able to meet them, you know, where they're at. So my bias says like start the weightlifting thing. But if your entry point into any physical activity is something else, then like that's way, way, way better than not doing anything.
And that, I mean, listen, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of this because we don't have much time left, but I think that's the beauty of finding a good trainer, right? Somebody, now I know you've kind of moved away from that now. You're not doing in-person stuff anymore. A lot of your business is online. I'm guessing you probably have some, you know, big name people that you're helping through their fitness journey.
It's more like on a, just to not be super specific, it's more like consulting. Like if you
so you're
way.
So you're doing it, and it's impressive. But I know you've had some beefs with some pretty big name people in there.
Sure. Yeah. You know what's funny is you and I were discussing like my transition and content style over the years.
Yeah.
And the more confident I have become in my own ability, the less conflict that I have sought out on the internet.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that people are not constantly seeking conflict with me, which this point,
I bet I've seen it,
man. Like people have like people make burner accounts. They'll block the burner account. They'll make another burner account. They'll drop a comment. And like, it's funny because there are specific people where everyone knows like who the person is.
Yeah.
And I
you
just
gotta feel bad for these people though. It's like, could you imagine having that much free time to be like, all right, I gotta go after this.
Or maybe even worse, like they don't have the free time and they're just spending their time that way anyway.
Yeah.
You know? So someone I look up to a lot in just in the general like podcasting space is Andrew Huberman. And the reason I look up to him a lot is because he handles himself. We had a brief exchange about this just because I was through DMs talking to him recently, and he said that he treats the internet like he's in a classroom setting. And when you have like a specific framework like that is sort of like your gut, because I still feel like the pull, the temptation to be like, let me just like
argue with these
like roast this person publicly. But you have to just like envision like what do I want people to know me for? Do I want people to respect me as someone who is able to handle themselves like an adult? Or do I want to get in internet fights with people who are 14 years old or maybe even 45 years old who make it their life's mission to attack someone who's 2 decades younger than them?
Yeah.
I'm not giving advice to anyone necessarily, but I just do at this point. I'm just like, I've heard so much of it. I'm almost, at least most of the time, I'm pretty bored by it.
Yeah, and you're pretty numb to it. Well, listen, I think that's all the time we have today, right? We're up on time. But I am super fortunate to call you a friend. I look up to you, even though you are much, much younger than me. If you guys don't follow him, where could everybody follow you or like kind of get in touch with you?
Yeah, Instagram, at my name.
And then you have a lot of online programming stuff that people do.
My biggest thing now is this online community. So a lot of trainers are in the community, a lot of coaches.
Very cool.
So a free trial. 1 week free trial.
1 week free trial at what's the website?
You can just find it through my Instagram.
Okay,
so,
cool. So go check out his link tree. But I am fortunate to call him a friend, and we're about to go to the gym and hit a session where I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, we got to train back today.
Ooh, look at that. Okay, mine's kind of flat. I need help with it.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, guys, thank you for joining us. Check out, like, subscribe on the Strong as Fuck podcast, and we'll see you guys on another episode.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Dude, that was great.